Singaporean. Grew up here all my life and studied here. Went early through JC before being fortunate enough to study overseas. And but with those perspectives, I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience, getting my legs, kind of digging into the realities of the humanitarian sector, and hopefully with that kind of framing, how do we as Singaporeans, or regardless of the international background that we belong to here as students, how can we use that moving forward as servants, I think, in society, regardless of what we do. And so the topic that I have today is talking about prioritizing the margins. And maybe I'll just jump into it so that we can get the morning, get the afternoon going, I should say. So how many of you want to be part of something big and immense, some kind of big change in your lifetime at least? Maybe help you raise your hands just to get a good idea. All right, so we all do, right? And that's probably why you're sitting here trying to get a different idea on how do I do this even. Now, if you're thinking about change, at some point you would have come across the idea of the ripple effect, right? Does that sound familiar? Right? So the idea that you cause something, you have cause an action, and you hope that it has a bigger ripple in the world in front of us. With the ripple effect, we think that it's our inputs that are going to have a bigger impact in the world, right? And when we hear about the ripple effect, we kind of focus on what the personal actor is in this case. So it's me, what am I going to do in the world, and how am I going to cause that change? And a lot of times, even for me, my name's Aimee. I have two personal pronouns in my name, I and me. And so I always have to be careful about making sure that when I'm doing anything, it's not just about me, but it's about those around me as well. And so when we're talking about pushing the boundaries, kind of looking at things in a new way, I want to actually stretch this analogy a little bit, okay? This idea of the ripple effect. And thankfully, I came to this context reading a book on margins and marginality by Jung Lee. And he gives this suggestion. Now imagine with me as you're walking to this pond, okay? You see this pond, it's a beautiful one, and you sit at the water's edge. And as you're looking out on this water's edge, calm waters, out jumps a huge fish in front of you, okay? Imagine that happens. And with it causes the ripples, right? The waves move out from the center and it kind of branches out towards the sides, towards the edge of the pond. Now something you didn't quite notice before as you're sitting on the water's edge is that the ripples not only hit the edge, but it moves back in, right? And for some reason, we always talk about the ripple effect from the center branching out. But we don't quite consider the dual direction of it, the dual nature of it, that it's about movement in and out. And that's because there's something there, that's the margins. We tend to always focus on what's in the center, with the impact coming from there. But you can't have a relationship one without the other. And I think the reality is that as we see it in that way, we're taught to think of the world from a place of centrality. And we all want to be at the center, right? And it's also because we feel like we deserve it, we strive for it, so therefore we should be there. But again, it's all about how it's related to the other, because you can't have one without the other. They coexist together. And so we need to remember that in our perspectives as well, because it gives us a newer perspective in how we frame the world. Again, like the positions of center positions, they tend to come with power, they tend to come with honor, with wealth a lot of times. And again, we want those things. But what tends to be on the edges, and which is actually the root word of the term margin, the edges, is that they tend to have the negative connotations, right? What is often unimportant, what's overlooked, what's minor. But I think it's important that we think about those concepts, because as a society, again, we can't have a center without the margins, or margins without the center. And if as a society, we need to be really thinking about those aspects on the side that we might not have contemplated before, because we've been such a pursuit to be the person causing the action in the middle. And so that's what I want to kind of get into today. It's, I see, again, I know that's a mixture of crowds here, but as a fellow Singaporean, I started to think about a little of these things from my secondary school days. How many of you did CIP, Community Involvement Programs? Comm service, right? You all know that. And perhaps in your own home countries, you've done some permutation of that. And now let's also be honest, how many of us kind of did it because we had to, maybe for CCA points, we had to get some kind of credit, right? We can admit that too, okay? And that's fine, maybe it brought us to the water and it introduced us to a little bit about it. But, as a Singaporean, I thought I was going through a normal track. I was going to go to school, I finished my secondary school, JC, and I was going to study. And that for me was very normal. But then I was actually sitting in a seat much like a lot of you. It was my first year of university 11 years ago. And I was in an anthropology class, and my professor introduced me to something called the 100people.org, in case you've heard of it. And so the idea was this: we're living in a world of 7-odd billion people, but it's hard to contextualize that sometimes, right? It's a lot of things to fathom. And so what this project does, and it's meant for school curriculums, is that it whittles it down to about 100, imagining that the world is just a village of just 100 people. And so you start hearing statistics, and I was sat in my chair just like you all, and one of the first things I heard was, in a village of 160 people would be Asian. Makes sense, right, from where we all are living. And then I heard 83 of them would be illiterate, so they would be able to read and write. Again, makes sense. I know it's not everybody, so that's quite a large number. And then I heard things like only 22 people would have a computer or an access to one. And then I thought, as a Singaporean, wait a minute, surely it's larger than that, right? And then I heard another one, in that village of 100, only 48 of those people would be living on less than $2.70 a day. So packet of chicken rice, maybe it's more expensive than that now. And I thought, okay, I know I'm from one of the most expensive countries in the world, but surely that's not a living wage for most people. But the one that really struck me in this village of 100 people was this stat about how many of us are degree holders. So many of you students here, again, have your bachelor's and pursuing something more than that. And I'm actually going to push it back to you, and not just from a global perspective, but as a Singaporean, or again, insert your citizenship here and from where you're coming from. What percentage of Singapore's labor force has a bachelor's degree and above? Shout out a number to the person next to you. If not, yell it out to me, please. Wild guesses. 40? 30? 60, I heard? 80. Okay, thank you. So this I found it off on SingStat, you can see .gov.sg, and the number is actually 26. And so maybe lower or higher depending on who you are, but that's the reality, right? And for those of you, some of you in the crowd, maybe you're a first-generation person from your family to get to go to school, and that's wonderful in itself. I had the privilege and maybe also spoilt. My parents were first and second generation to go to school. So for me, it was a given. Yeah, I'm going to go to school, that's normal. But even among the age brackets in Singapore, between those above 55 years old, the number is very low. It's actually only about 6 or 7%. And for those in our age bracket, so that the number is 25 to 34 years old, that number is 49%, probably higher today because the stats is from a few years ago. So that means every other Singaporean in our age group has a higher degree, right? And so we take it as normal, but what are we doing with it? Now I'm going to go back to that village I mentioned. What percentage of the global labor force has a degree, do you think? Shout out a number again, please. 10, 1, 40. So now you got comparisons, right? So now you're being a bit careful with your numbers. And actually, 11 years ago, when I was a first-year student, the number was 1%. And I remember thinking, no, there's no way. It can't be that small, right? And I remember there was this weight, literally this weight falling on my shoulders. And actually, the global number today is about 7%. You can see the stats at the bottom there. And that's also because so much has grown in the last decade, because the middle class in India and China, parts of the African continent, has grown so quickly that the numbers increase. But still, 7%, such a small fraction of the world, has the privileges and accesses that we have with our education, right? And so it made me think, around that time, actually, when I was going to school, Spider-Man was a big popular movie. Do you remember that scene with the uncle when he says, with great power comes... Wow, okay, well, watch Spider-Man. Excellent. With great power comes great responsibility. And I feel like that summed up my experience as a younger person in my first year of university. And so it made me question, I had this lottery, it seems, of citizenship as a Singaporean, between my race, my class, the things that I could access. And it made me wonder, what am I going to do with it? And so it framed the rest of my experience in university and in public service, and made me question, how am I going to use the unique skills that I have, my interests that I have, and the positions of power again, because sometimes we think, oh, I'm just another person, I'm just another student, but again, just one example of the power of your education, how are we going to use it moving forward from here? And so I went about school, and I was very involved in public service activities. I pursued my bachelor's in in political science and globalization studies, focused on peace and justice issues. And I was very involved in works in the community. Some friends and I, we realized that there was a lot of food going to waste in our dining halls in school. And so we started a food recycling program for those in the community on the margins, because we didn't want to look so far away. We started with just our small university town. And I went from there, and my first job after school was what introduced me to the refugee communities while I was in the States. And it was hard for me to kind of conceptualize these ideas without a diagram, and so something I hope to present to you today is this concept of being on the edge of the inside. And it's insight that I got actually from a Catholic monk I was reading by the name of Richard Waror from the Center for Action and Contemplation, as you see there. And his idea is this, that in any issue with any part of society, oops, I hope I didn't turn that off. Hopefully the diagram that comes back up, you'll see a circle. And in the midst of a circle, there's always a center point, right? The folks where power lies, where the dominant thought lies, where the decision making is done. But then from there, there's going to be the margins. Imagine that there's a wider circle on the outside, and there's always folks on the margin, regardless of the issue that we're passionate about, whether it's about education, poverty, the environment, animals, welfare, you name it. There's always something on the margins and people that we need to be caring about, some issue. And so the idea of being on the edge of the inside, which hopefully we can see as an image, is that we're just on that precipice right there. And being on the edge, it takes an effort for us to put ourselves there. And sometimes it's a little scary, we're not so sure how that's going to look. But it's about not conforming to things just because it's comfortable and it's a comfortable place on the inside where the dominant voices are. At the same time, it's not just somebody throwing stones. You know, we love to complain as Singaporeans, that's what we're notorious for. But without being constructive, giving constructive criticism. At the same time, when you place yourself in certain spaces and you're vulnerable to it, you're also able to empathize with those on the margins that you might not have done before. And so again, I don't want these to just be concepts and ideas, and you know, I can't speak to anything else but my story, and that's a little bit of what I want to share today. And that's my first job, again, the working with refugees from there. And a lot of times when we think about humanitarian work and what that looks like, we tend to think exactly it's this. We don't think it's this, that it's work behind a desk at a computer documenting issues of justice. And in this photo, actually, it was my next job that I pursued, working on the Thailand border with hill tribe communities with a human rights agency working on anti-human trafficking issues. And again, with working on people on the borders, the literal margins of society, the borders of a country who are stateless and vulnerable to trafficking issues, that really opened my eyes to the importance of placing myself on the edge of the inside. So again, some people are verbal learners, some need to hear it, some need to see it, so hopefully this helps. So again, positioning ourselves on the edge of the margins, on the edge of the inside, is a unique position to be in. Now, a lot of times also people say like, oh, Aimee, you know, you're out there saving the world and you're so nice, you're doing comm service, things like that. And that kind of language actually makes me very uncomfortable because it kind of implies this idea of like a savior complex, I'm going out there to do things, but I don't think it's that. I think part of it is that we're here to facilitate change as well with the positions of power that we have. And for me, that speaks greatly. There's an author from India, and she's also an activist by the name of Arundhati Roy. And she says, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And I think that says it well because there are people who are intentionally silenced or not heard, and so we're not there to necessarily speak for them, but to be as facilitated to project what those things are because there's broader systemic issues at hand. I mentioned again, humanitarian work isn't just always in the field. Even this is me in Thailand, but wherever you are as SMU students, whether it means you end up in business and finance, in management, whatever your positions and your passions are, be where you are and think differently. Think about people's on the margins and look at issues differently. My next job took me, I was again interested in refugee issues, and the reason for that was me as a Singaporean, our powerful red book passport takes me and I'm able to travel all around the world without much problem, to be honest. But I was very moved by refugee communities who are forced, displaced, who don't have those options, and if anything are stuck where they are. And it really made me empathize and want to explore more. And so I worked at 9 official refugee camps on the Thai-Burma border, and I was living in one of them. And I had a very fortunate, unique opportunity to do that as one of the few foreigners allowed to stay there. I worked in a higher education program with young adults who are young leaders and kind of working on community development issues. And again, I don't mean that what I did was a great thing. If anything, I learned so much more from my students. But what allowed me to be in community, immersed in this space, taught me more about refugees and refugee life than I ever could just working at a desk or reading about it in a book. And that allowed me to empathize a lot more on the issues. And so again, what I want to share today is that you don't have, my examples, I can only speak to my life, but it doesn't mean that you have to go very far away to think about these issues. Maybe you're going back to your home countries if you're from overseas, or you want to do work right here in Singapore in your own backyard. I think it's important that we see those realities more than just having to do CCA points or CIP points because we have to. And that just means, and that's also something in business, right? We know about CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I think that sometimes we, folks might do it kind of as a box checked. Okay, I did that, so I'm safe. But I think we need to be thinking about how are we really engaged in it. And perhaps some of you as students here, you think, man, I don't know where to begin. I don't know what I bring to the spaces that I'm in. But the reality is that we all have perspective. And we all, I have a pair of spectacles. Some of you in the crowd do too. We all have our own unique lenses that we come into the world with. Some of it might be from our own personal home experiences, our life experiences, the schools we went to in the certain neighborhoods, or other bigger schools. It doesn't matter. We all come with unique lenses that color our view of the world, and that's a space that you can contribute to as well. And again, I can only speak to some of my experiences, but if some of you might be interested in public service work, humanitarian sector, however that might look, some of the things that I've gleaned over the years and I'm still learning involve some of the following, perhaps do's and don'ts that we might be able to do. And so wherever you are in your seats, wherever you are, you do hold positions of power. I mentioned again that unique ability of not just knowledge that you have with a certificate. Certificates aren't that important. That doesn't define who you are as a human being, but it's what you do with it and those positions of power you're in. I also want to advise against romanticizing helping because it sounds nice and sometimes we want to do it with good intentions, but we must be careful as well that we aren't hurting communities in the spaces that we're in. Similarly, again, in whatever space we're in, whether it's in our classrooms, there's always power dynamics, right? We know that there's always something involved, whether it's in your workspace or your neighborhoods, wherever you belong to, your dormitories even that you belong to, there's always something broader that can be used in your position to be leveraged. The other thing is about the dangers that when we have positions of authority and decision making, we tend to feel the need to prescribe and tell people what to do. But that can be a little dangerous as well, and we should caution against it because we shouldn't just prescribe without asking those on the margins, those who are serving, asking what it is that they want and need, because otherwise it's not a helpful endeavor either. And the way to do that is to be participatory. We always need to make sure we're engaging people around us to make sure that's what's needed and it's not of no use either. And so to conclude really, again, I feel like I'm early in my career in itself, and there are lots of things that I'm figuring out as it does best serving refugee communities in urban and rural settings. And I might not have all the right answers. In fact, I know I don't. But something that's helped me in my work and in the organizations that I've been in is that it's not just about what you do, but how you do it. And that also entails how you view things in a more holistic way. And I suggest that we need to view it from the spaces of margins and not just center spaces. And with that, you'd be able to answer a lot of the world's needs. A lot of you started with saying you want to impact change. And I suggest how we do that is if we're considering the margins. Thank you so much.